This is Join Us in France, episode 79. Hello, I'm Annie, and Join Us in France is an independent travel podcast about all things French. On the show, we discuss places you can visit in France, French food, French wine, French culture, French history, a little bit of French language thrown in the mix, all put together to help you enjoy your next visit to France to the fullest. It's great to be back after a wonderful vacation where I saw a lot of new things, and a couple of them had to do with France, so I'm sure I'll be talking about them on the podcast, but that will be for another day. It'll be more fun for you to hear about this vacation while I'm chit-chatting with Elise than me just telling you about my vacation. So today, I'm going to tell you a story that so gripped me that I haven't stopped reading and thinking about it while on vacation. It's a story of courage, intelligence, and success that took place between Poland and France. Our story begins in Warsaw, in Poland, where at age 17, a young girl who went by Mania made the tremendous decision that would lead her to being the first female to receive a Nobel Prize in any discipline. She made a pact with her 20-year-old sister, Bronia, to hire herself out as a full-time governess so that her sister could pursue her dream, study medicine in Paris. In return, Mania, the 17-year-old, wanted her older sister to become a medical doctor, come back to Poland, and practice medicine, and also help support the young Mania through her own years of school later. Bronia, who was the older one, had already saved up enough money to travel to Paris and pay for 1 year of rooms, board, and school. And their father, who was not a rich man, but who was a tremendously enlightened man for 1884, had given his blessing so that his daughters could be as well educated as he was. What he couldn't give them was enough money to study in Paris because he didn't have it. So the sisters made money as tutors in Warsaw. Both of them worked very hard, but tutoring paid poorly, and at the rate they were able to save, neither of them would ever leave Poland. Which kind of begs the question, why did they have to leave Poland to begin with? Well, the reason is simple. The universities were still closed to women in Poland. And universities were barely open to women in France also, but a few were admitted. In Paris, there were fewer than 10 women in medical school between 1873, fewer than 40 from 1873 to 1881, and fewer than 100 in 1884, when this pact was made between the two sisters. In 1887, out of the 114 women who were undertaking medical studies, no more than 12 of them were French. 70 were Russian, 20 were Polish, 8 were English, 1 North American, 1 Austrian, 1 Greek, and 1 Turkish. Now, for reference, today, women doctors make up 45% of all doctors in France, and that proportion keeps on increasing. In another 10 years, there will be more women than men in the medical professions in France. But back to our young sisters. They were extremely bright, and they were hungry for knowledge. And no matter how they sliced it, it took steady income to risk going abroad as a student, especially as a female student. Now, you probably know by now that this Mania I'm talking about is Marie Curie, her French name. I guess in English I would have to say Marie Curie. I'm not sure actually how you say that name properly in English. But her original name was Mania Sklodowska, and I'm pretty sure I'm butchering that name. Apologies for any Polish listeners. She's the one, so Marie is the one who took the initiative and laid out the plan. She said, I'm going to get a job as a governess in a family. With board, lodging, and laundry all free, I shall have 400 rubles in a year in wages, perhaps more. And her sister Bronia said, why should I be the first to go? Why not the other way around? You're so gifted, probably more gifted than I am. You would succeed quickly Why should I go? Marie responded, "Oh, Bronya, don't be stupid. You need to go first because you are 20 and I am 17, because you've been waiting for hundreds of years and I've got lots of time." And so it was done. It was a really gutsy move. What could possibly go wrong, right? Could it be that Bronya does poorly at the Paris Medical School and never graduates? Could it be that Bronya gets swept off her feet and runs off in search of adventure of a more carnal nature? You know, that never happens to anybody age 20, right? Could it be that Bronya doesn't keep her word? Could it be a combination of all three? Could it be that the sisters have a falling out? The way was fraught with danger. So why am I telling you about Marie Curie today? Why did I pick her? Well, because on my last visit to Paris, I had the great joy of visiting her newly renovated museum in Paris. It's at the Sorbonne. It's a pretty small museum and it's not open every day, all day. But I really think you need to go, because if you have any interest in this incredible family, because it's the whole family was outstanding, you will really feel inspired by what you see there. And to prepare for this episode, I read 2 books. One, and the one that grabbed me the most, was written by her own daughter, Eva, I guess you could say, who was an author and journalist and was very careful in telling the stories that she had heard and interviewing her mother. And so I think it's a pretty faithful account. And of course, no account is ever 100% accurate. There are always more than one side to any story. But I think that account really helped me see the woman that she was and the researcher that she was, and understand her a lot better, because my whole life I've heard of Marie Curie, but you just know she was a fabulous scientist, but you don't know that much about it. And when I dug in, I just loved what I found out. So let me share with you what I found out so that you can enjoy the visit to that small museum in the Sorbonne even more. She was a woman who gathered up a lot of firsts. She was the first woman to receive a doctorate degree in France, and the first woman to earn that doctorate in physics. She was also the first female professor at a great Parisian university, the Sorbonne. She was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize for physics in 1903, and 8 years later she became the first scientist, male or female, to be awarded a second Nobel Prize, this time for chemistry. The first Nobel Prize she received was shared between her and her husband, got half of it, and her husband was Pierre, and Henri Becquerel, who had done a lot of research in that area as well. When they received this Nobel Prize in 1903, the Nobel Prizes were only 3 years old. Okay, so they caught the attention of the group very quickly. 8 years later, in 1911, she got a solo award, this time in chemistry. Marie's daughter, Irene Joliot-Curie, I'm not sure how I would say that in English. You'll have to forgive me. I'm going to say them in French. She was awarded the Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 1935 with her husband, Frédéric Joliot-Curie, for the discovery of artificial radioactivity. Now, this is interesting because you often hear of women keeping their maiden name and hyphenating their maiden name with their married name. That happens a lot in the West. Well, in this case, the name is hyphenated, but he took his wife's name, and they did this on their wedding day. It's not like they thought about it later. No, so she went by Joliot-Curie, his name and her name, and so did he. So Marie Curie was born on November 7th, 1867 in Warsaw, in Poland, and she was born and raised in Warsaw. At the time, Poland was ruled by Russia. Her parents have lovely names, but I'm afraid I can't say them. But her father was a professor and vice president of a boys' school where he taught physics and mathematics. And he taught that to his daughters as well, and son. And their mother was also a principal, but at a private primary school for girls. Marie started going to school at age 10, and she excelled right from the beginning. All of the Sklodowska children did really well at school. They were all very, very bright. By age 17, Marie could already speak several languages, so she could do Polish, Russian, English, German, French, and she could also read Latin and Greek. I mean, just big brain people. Marie was the youngest of 5. One little girl died along the way, and her mother died also when she was about 15. The other thing that happened is, unfortunately, because of changing political winds in Poland, her father kept on getting demoted at work. And so he kept getting positions that were less and less profitable. And as a result, by the end of his life, he really wasn't able to support his children in a way that he would have liked to. And that's why the girl worked so hard, because they felt like they were poor. I don't know that they were truly poor, but things were very tight. And for her whole life, that would really change the way she was in a very deep, meaningful way. In 1894, Marie meets Pierre. She was 22 years old, and they met in a very cute way. They were both looking for laboratory space to conduct experiments, and a mutual friend introduced them. And they started collaborating and working together, and the collaboration turned into romance, and then they married, and they had 2 daughters. So it was a very fruitful happenstance meeting. So Marie went to Paris to study physics. And when she got done with her master's degree in physics, she decided she also needed a master's degree in mathematics. And so she just never stopped working and studying. She was just going. From one topic to the other. Pierre Curie was also a physicist, although he was doing crystal work. He was more of an experimentalist, and she really looked up to him for that, because she felt that that's where she needed to get better. And so they worked together jointly on many projects. And at one point, Pierre stopped his own work on crystals to join Marie's efforts in radioactivity. And honestly, the whole book is full of tales of them working in inadequate places where it's too cold, it's windy, it's not clean enough. They're trying to do difficult research in terrible surroundings and circumstances, but that never stopped them. They just kept pushing along. But they did ask for help left and right, but they usually didn't get any. One of the many places where they worked was a shed where medical students used to store cadavers. I mean, and it's in that shed that they discovered the new elements. In 1998, they submitted their work on polonium, and on December 26th that same year, they discovered radium. So it was just a super productive year. In 1898, she and her husband and other collaborators discovered 2 new elements, and she had a 1-year-old. She gave birth to her daughter, Irene, to her first daughter in 1997. So this is crazy to me, how productive this woman was. You have a baby at home, and you go to the lab, and you discover 2 elements. Like, this is what people do, right? One of the things that made that possible is that, unfortunately, her mother-in-law passed away just as the brand new baby was born. And so the father-in-law decided that he wanted to spend time with his baby to kind of get his heart into the future instead of constantly being sad over his wife's death. And so he offered a lot of babysitting, and he spent a lot of time with the baby, and that probably made it possible for Marie to spend time away from her baby daughter and doing what she needed to do. So if you look at the timeline, 1898, they published their first research on radioactivity. They don't get the Nobel Prize till 1903, and she was still just a master's degree student, right? They keep publishing, they are writing books and papers and all sorts of things, but they're just master's degree. Well, she is just a master's degree student. He's 9 years older than she is, so he has his doctoral dissertation done already. But she completes her doctoral dissertation in 1903. One of the sad facts of this whole research thing is that in 1901, Marie and Pierre mention in a paper that a thick sheet of lead can protect people from radiation, but they didn't really take that very stringent measures to protect themselves. As a matter of fact, Pierre subjected himself to having direct contact with radium on his skin just to see what it would do. And what it did is it burned his skin and created lesions. And that's how he realized that it could kill tumors. And right away, Pierre was very interested in using radium for medical purposes. He got it right away. And that was one of the wonderful things about this whole story, is that they started helping people who had cancers very quickly, as soon as they realized it. Now, I want to take a little sidetrack here in this biography to tell you about 12 specific instances in which you can see how strong the discrimination against women was at the time. For one thing, she could not enroll in the university in Poland. She had to expatriate herself in order to study. The second thing is that everyone naturally assumed that she was assisting her husband in his work, but that he was leading the way. She was always seen as a helpmeet everywhere she went. And how do you fight that without coming across as totally shrill and bitter? Well, she didn't really fight it. But thankfully, her husband fought it. Madame Lavoisier was another French scientist. Well, she was in the same boat. Jane Marseille, who published a textbook that was used in the UK and the USA for over 30 years, she had to do it anonymously because it wouldn't have been accepted otherwise. So the great luck that Marie had is that her husband fought to give her recognition. He mentioned her in all the papers. As a matter of fact, some of the things that they did together, he had her sign her name first because he knew she would totally get overlooked otherwise. The third way in which she had to fight discrimination against women is that she didn't get a chance to teach at the Sorbonne until she was offered her husband's chair after he died. She took it because he always told her how she would make a great teacher and it was too bad that she didn't have a teaching position. But she knew that, she was just replacing him. But she still took it, which I think was a very good decision. The fourth thing is that her husband, Pierre, always insisted heavily on her accomplishments. He insisted, like I said, that she takes all the credit. Another thing is, and get this just kills me. The nomination for the Nobel Prize in 1903 did not initially include Marie's name. Pierre protested and Marie was added as a prize recipient. Now, how many husbands and collaborators do not find it as important to acknowledge the work of a female scientist, and they just take advantage of the fact that, people will just assume that the guy did it and that the girl had nothing to do with it, There are many examples of women who went unrecognized. For instance, the one that comes to my mind immediately is the Rosalind Franklin, who she used X-ray to take a picture of DNA, and that would totally change biology. But the two guys who got the Nobel Prize for the discovery of DNA never mentioned that if they hadn't seen that picture that she took, they would have probably not come up with it that quickly, or maybe not at all. So that was a major, major thing for Marie Curie, is that the men around her, at least her husband, was very, very careful to give her credit every time that she deserved it, which was a lot. And it's not just about sexism, because academic work is really, really competitive, and there is no incentive to share the glory. So if a guy is assumed to be the force behind a discovery, well, he'll keep quiet about it, and it doesn't matter if it's a guy who helped him or a woman who helped him, he'll just keep quiet about it. That's just how it works. Another major point is that Pierre and Marie authored many papers together, and they did some alone too, but they authored a lot together. But Marie could not present her findings to the French Academy of Sciences because, being a woman, she was not a member of the Academy to begin with. And you can't present if you're not a member. So, de facto, all women were excluded until Marie broke that glass ceiling a few years after her husband's death. And as a matter of fact, her husband also had a bear of a time getting himself recognized into the French Academy of Sciences, but that was for political reasons more than anything. Madame Curie was the first woman to be offered a teaching position at the Sorbonne, but that came along after both of her Nobel Prizes. Can you imagine? They have a person who has 2 Nobel Prizes. Like, maybe we should give her a teaching position. That's just... The 9th point I want to make is that the Marie Curie Museum in Paris is tiny. There are completely unknown men in Paris today that have a huge statue in Paris. We don't know who the dude is, but he's got this huge statue in Paris. And yet, one of the most brilliant scientists the world has ever known gets a tiny museum. That is just not right. She also gets a nice museum in Warsaw. I haven't had a chance to visit it, but I think that's just outrageous. One of the ways in which it was hard to untangle what was his research, what was her research, is that in French, even to this day, when you write a formal paper, you don't use the first person. We use the royal we. So, nous allons démontrer, and it makes it hard to know who did what. The Curie couple mostly used we, but on occasion they used the term one of us when it was clearly an individual finding. But even if I wrote a research paper on something that I wrote, I discovered by myself, I would still say we, which is kind of silly, but that's just a style. And Marie Curie is often described as hardworking, diligent, patient, pain-suffering person, all that, while the male scientists are described as creative and critical. But you really need both. How could you argue that the first and only person to get 2 Nobel Prizes, in 2 different fields is not full of creativity? Of course she was creative, but we have a hard time acknowledging that when talking about female scientists. And the last point is that Marie Curie taught science to women at normal school, École Normale Supérieure de Jeunes Filles in Sèvres, near Paris. She could have taught anywhere, but the tradition confined her to this particular institution. She loved it, but it was quite limiting. Now, her whole life, Marie Curie was a teacher. She taught kids, she taught adults, she taught all ages, she did practical teaching during the First World War. She did all sorts of teaching, and she never stopped teaching, as well as writing and researching. I love this quote by Albert Einstein, and she was friends with Albert Einstein. The couple was, both of them. He said, Marie Curie is, of all celebrated beings, the only one whom fame has not corrupted. And indeed, she was very reluctant to acknowledge fame, to embrace it, and to make the most of it. She was a private person who didn't see what the big deal was. In her mind, she was still that poor kid from Warsaw who had to work hard. And that's how she saw herself, and she never snapped out of it, no matter how successful and recognized she got. As a matter of fact, she turned down honors many times, especially as a younger person. By the later years of her life, she had just given up and accepted all sorts of recognitions. And she got, there's a list at the end of the book. It's like 10 pages long. It's like ridiculous. The Alliance Française of New York City, so that's a French teaching group, gave her some sort of high honor. And she got stuff from MIT and all these super famous institutions, but also very small institutions felt the need to give her recognition because she was so awesome. And if you wonder why she always felt like a poor person, well, it's probably, like coming to Paris as a poor student. She lived in the Latin Quarter mostly, in some really tiny rooms with just a few objects that she possessed. She had an iron folding bed. She had a mattress that she had brought from Poland for some reason. She had a stove. She had a wooden table. She had a kitchen chair, wash basin, a few things, but very little. 2 plates, a knife, a fork, a spoon. I mean, there's a long list of things. And also, as a young student in Paris, Marie Curie had ruled out love and marriage out of her life's program. There was a reason why she had a very unfortunate relationship when she was still in Poland before she came to France. But she just didn't think that love and marriage was important. She just wanted to study and research. But, of course, when she met Pierre, he was 35, she was 26. It wasn't really love at first sight, but she liked him from the start, and he had to pursue her pretty ardently because she didn't see the point, but eventually he won. And you know how he first courted her? I thought that was so cute. He sent her a copy of his latest article, which was called On Symmetry in Physical Phenomena, symmetry of an electric field and of a magnetic field. And on the first page, he wrote in his awkward hand, to Mademoiselle Sklodowska, with the respect and friendship of the author. That was courtship. And then he asked if he could visit her in her apartment, and he did so. But he was struck by how poor she was compared to him. But he admired her tenacity and drive. And sometimes she encouraged him to complete work he hadn't finished. And then he asked her to come to Sceaux, a place near Paris, to meet his family. And he also wrote her a lot of letters. And after a long time, she accepted his marriage proposal, and they were very happy. They were a wonderful couple for their whole life. But she didn't want a white dress. She didn't want a gold ring. She didn't want a wedding breakfast, no religious ceremony, even though she was raised Catholic. But after her mother died, she had a lot of questions that were unanswered, and her heart wasn't in it. Pierre was a free thinker, and so they kept it really simple, and it's very stark. If you see a picture of the two of them on their wedding day, they're both dressed in black. It looks like it's very strange. But they were just odd ducks, both of them, That's just who they were. And for their honeymoon, they roamed the roads of Île-de-France, so all around Paris, on bicycles. And they loved to cycle around. And they went on long rides, and that's how they got around most of the time. And they were just famous for that. They enjoyed that very much. But I have to say, a honeymoon on a bicycle? No. Even as a young person, I don't think I would have gone for it. So they were really odd ducks. Good odd ducks, in a good way. And she tried to insert some domestic virtues into their daily lives, but she took some cooking lessons, and she woke up early every day to go grocery shopping, but she didn't love it. I mean, she did it because but she didn't really love it. And in her work as a scientist, Marie Curie was extremely good at always asking the right questions. Because really, the question you ask is more important than the answer you get. Because if you don't ask a good question, the answer won't matter. So she built her whole research plan on other scientists' work, as that's the way science works, right? Somebody called Röntgen discovered X-rays. Henri Poincaré, he had the idea that he wanted to know if things like X-rays are emitted by fluorescent bodies under the action of light or not. Henri Becquerel, who got the Nobel Prize with the Curie couple, he examined the salts of a rare metal, the uranium, and he realized that the phenomenon he was looking at was not what he expected. He saw something that he didn't understand. He figured out that uranium salts spontaneously emit, without any exposure to light, some rays of an unknown nature. And he made sure that these surprising properties were not caused by exposure to the sun. So he kept his uranium in the darkness for several months, and then he observed it again, and there was still stuff shining through. So he observed radiation long before Marie Curie gave it the name and explained it further, but he had no idea what he was looking at. And so Marie Curie was fascinated by this discovery by Becquerel, and she just asked the right question, said, what is this? What is the nature of this radiation? And she found it, but it took a long time. And the more Marie learned about uranium rays, the more they seemed really different, totally unknown. They were like nothing else. Nothing affected these uranium rays. They were kind of feeble, but they were really different. And she turned this mystery over and over in her head, and eventually she came to the conclusion that this incomprehensible radiation was an atomic property. And she asked, even though the phenomenon had only been observed with uranium, nothing proved that uranium was the only chemical element capable of emitting such a radiation. So she looked at a lot of other bodies to see if she could find it. So she looked for compounds of other elements that she had access to because she was at a university, so they had samples of many things. And she realized that thorium also emitted spontaneous rays, like those of uranium, of a similar intensity. So it wasn't just uranium that was doing it, now she had thorium. And so she had something, but she gave it a name. She called it radioactivity, but she still didn't know enough about it, so she kept searching. Okay, and then she comes to a dramatic revelation. And I'm just going to read what her daughter wrote because I'm not sure I fully understand it. It says, the radioactivity was a great deal stronger than could have been normally foreseen by the quantity of uranium or thorium contained in the products examined. It must be an error in experiment, she thought. And so she started to measure over again many times. She did 10 times, 20 times, 30 times, and eventually she was forced to yield to the evidence. The quantities of uranium and thorium found in these minerals were by no means sufficient to justify the exceptional intensity of the radiation she observed. So by now she knows that uranium and thorium are radioactive. But then she realizes that the strength of the radioactivity that she finds has nothing to do with the quantity of material she's looking at. And she doesn't understand that. There must be something separate from uranium and thorium that gives that radioactivity. And so she did a bunch more experiments. And those are the experiments that led her to understand that thorium and uranium contained a radioactive substance. it was at the same time a chemical element until then unknown. It was a new element. She repeated experiments so many times that she convinced herself that there had to be a third element in there. There was something different. And she looked and looked and looked. And it really took her years to isolate it fully, but she got to it. And when I was reading this, I liked the fact that when she found something she couldn't explain, she didn't rush to the conclusion that, well, it must be aliens or something like that. She just said, well, there's something we don't know about this. Let me find out what we don't know. And that's really what makes her genius, is that she went looking for information that nobody else knew and that she found. But again, it took her years. And at some point along the way, she and Pierre realized that there were probably two new elements, because there were things they couldn't explain. And honestly, this is not a science show, so I'm not going to try and go into that. And I probably would do a terrible job at explaining it to you anyway. But they have this substance called pitchblende. It's uranium, essentially. And they break it down into its most basic forms, and they realize that there are two things they don't get in there. They don't understand, and they want to know more about. And the first one they're going to find, they named polonium, from the name of her native country. And the second one that they're going to announce several months later is radium. And these are the two new elements that they added to the table of elements, that we study in chemistry. So to prove that you have a new element, you have to isolate it and you have to show it somehow. And so what they did is they couldn't afford to buy uranium. It was too expensive. So they found somewhere, and the French government would not help them. The university would not help them fund this research. So they found somewhere in Austria that had a lot of residue of this material, and they bought several tons of it, 8 tons of it. And they got it shipped to them by train in large bags. And the 8 tons of material is that's what she extracted 1 gram of radium out of. From 8 tons to 1 gram. It took her 4 years. 4 years of essentially boiling things away, grinding things. She invented the process. And apparently it's still pretty much the process that they use today, except that she did it all by hand and mostly alone. Her husband was doing other experiments, and so there she was in the courtyard. She was dressed in her dust-covered, smock. Her hair was blowing in the wind. She was surrounded by smoke, which stung her eyes and throat. And she was a factory that for 4 years worked to reduce 8 tons of pitchblende into 1 gram of radium. And along the way, there were some people from the university who would come by and ask, what are you guys working on? What is this? And remember, she's not an employee of the university. He is, but she's not. And she's still going to work day in and day out looking for radium. And they get very little support from the university. It's actually very sad how little support they got. And when they were asked, what is it going to be like, this new element? They like to say, I should like it to have a very beautiful color. And yes, it does have a very nice color. Unfortunately, it'll kill you too, but it's beautiful. So, in 1902, 45 months after the day on which the Curies announced the probable existence of radium, Marie finally carted off the victory in this war of attrition. She succeeded in pairing 1 decigram, so that's 1/10 of a gram, I told you wrong earlier, of pure radium and made the first determination of the atomic weight of the new substance, which was 225. It took 45 months. And of course, an army of incredulous chemists, now they had the stuff in front of them because of the superhuman, obstinate person that had spent all these months grinding it down, and she brought it into existence. To me, it's like, all right, I take a ton of cake batter and I try to isolate vanilla, I have this large vat of cake batter and I think, ooh, that smells good. What is the smell? Let me grind it down, extract all the other things from the cake batter and just get a gram of pure vanilla extract. Working backwards like that is super complicated. I have no idea how she did it. I certainly wouldn't know how to get the vanilla out of cake batter. Well, she didn't either. She figured it out. And while Marie was isolating radium, Pierre had been teaching part-time at the School of Physics. And he drew a small salary, but the funds were not enough. And so he applied for a professorship at the Sorbonne, which paid a lot better, but he didn't get it. And they were slighted many times. They were, overlooked for other positions, both of them. She more than him, but still, they just didn't take it. They weren't taken seriously at the beginning. The University of Geneva in Switzerland wanted them to come teach there, and they offered Pierre Curie a chair in physics and a good salary. But when they realized that going to Switzerland would mean giving up their current research on radium, they just couldn't take it, and so they turned it down. And in Switzerland, they would have given both of them a teaching position, see? But to her, what mattered was continuing her research. She put that above all things. And then a few times, the French government offered them the Legion of Honor, la Légion d'honneur, but they turned it down. And that might have been a technical error, because in France, when you get offered that, when you have that, it elevates you. And I think I understand why they turned it down. They just didn't see the point. But it would have helped them probably get a professorship for Pierre anyway, and I think it would have put them on a better track. But they didn't accept. And then when 1903 rolled around, that was a very difficult year because Marie was pregnant with a baby, and the little girl was born prematurely and died. And also her sister's second boy died of meningitis, and Pierre started suffering terrible pains that were attributed to rheumatism. But that year, 1903, was a really bad year for them. And yet, they still published and researched and were involved with 32 scientific communications between 1899 and 1904. At some point along the way, Marie Curie wrote about how the various objects used in the chemical laboratory and those which serve for experiments in physics all become radioactive in a short time and act upon photographic plates through black paper. So the dust, the air in the room, the clothes, everything becomes radioactive, and the air in the room is a conductor. And in the laboratory where we work, the evil has reached an acute stage, and we can no longer have any apparatus completely isolated. So she knew that it was in everything, but she was more worried about being able to continue her research and isolate the element completely rather than think of her health. I think they just thought that radium was going to be all good, and it's not. like I told you before, Pierre exposed his arm to the action of radium. A lesion appeared. He watched over it, followed its evolution, and then when he wrote a report to the Academy, he described the symptoms. He says, after the action of the rays, the skin became red over a surface of 6 square centimeters. The appearance was that of a burn, but the skin was not painful, or barely so. At the end of several days, the redness, without growing larger, began to increase in intensity. On the 20th day, it formed scabs, and then a wound which was dressed with bandages. On the 42nd day, the epidermis began to form again on the edges, working towards the center, and 52 days after the action of the rays, there was still a surface of 1 square centimeter in the condition of a wound, which assumed a grayish appearance, indicating deeper mortification. So, struck by this action of the rays on flesh, he studied the action of radium on animals, and he collaborated with 2 medical professors, and very quickly they came to the conclusion that by destroying diseased cells, the radium could cure growth, tumors, and certain forms of cancer, and this therapeutic method was to be called Curie therapy. And this fact alone created a radium industry, because now it has medical applications, and it's become huge. Now, at one point, Pierre and Marie discuss whether or not they should patent the method by which you arrive at radium. And very quickly, they rejected the whole idea of patenting it. They said, what scientists do is publish their results. We don't patent. Well, that had a huge implication on the rest of their lives, because they gave birth to a new industry, and radium, because of its applications in medicine, became extremely expensive. And there they were, a few times in their lives, unable to buy radium. So they had to raise funds so that various institutions, other benefactors, groups of people in America especially, gathered funds so that Marie Curie could have access to pure radium, because they had not patented it. If they had, they would have become incredibly rich, and they would have been able to pursue whatever studies they wanted to do. Instead of doing that, they published, and they gave anybody who wanted the information detailed steps of how you go from pitch blende to radium, and that made people fabulously rich, but not the Curies. And it was their decision. They didn't get robbed of it. They just decided not to go in that direction. If I may criticize them just a tiny bit, that's the one place where I think they should have made a different decision, because if they had become rich, they would have had the most fabulous laboratories, beautiful facilities. They would have been able to hire whoever they wanted to help them, and they would have been able to lead this research much faster than the old ways when they were fighting for every dime, and their future was always uncertain. But it was important to Marie Curie that it stays in the realm of science and not profit. And for her, it was important to completely keep the two separate. So you might be wondering what happened to the Nobel Prize money. There is quite a bit of money that comes with it. Well, for the first one, they split anyway. And they gave a ton of money away. They gave money to Polish students, to people they knew who were in need. They just didn't keep most of the money. To them, it was almost dirty money. I guess that's the impression I get from reading her daughter's book. She did get a modern bathroom installed in their house on Boulevard Kellerman. But they used the money quickly and not to for their own benefit for the most part. And the French government was terribly, terribly slow in recognizing them. They were super famous all over the world, but in France, So again, now their country is France, right? So nul n'est prophète en son pays, right? You can't be a prophet in your own village. They had a lot of snubs. And the Curies didn't really want the recognition. They were always very ambivalent about that. For instance, if anybody recognized them in the street and people asked her, "Aren't you Madame Curie?" She was always like in a very neutral tone, which she had practiced. She would say, "No, you're mistaken." She never sought acknowledgement or public recognition. She actually seemed to really hate it. Wherever they went, like if they booked a hotel or something, they used false names and they dressed up as peasants, whatever. And they just didn't want to be recognized. And one day, an American journalist who had very cleverly followed Marie Curie confronted her and asked her if she was Marie Curie, and eventually she gave in and talked to her. And the woman asked her, why are you so media shy? Why won't you talk to anybody? And she responded, "In science, we must be interested in things, not in persons." So that was that. That's why she didn't want recognition. The things, radium was interesting, not her. And all along, both of them are experiencing strange symptoms. Fatigue, extreme fatigue. Sometimes they are so weak they're unable to travel. She didn't go to the Nobel to collect her Nobel Prize the first time because she was so ill. It was just really hard, and I'm just assuming that it had to do with exposure to the radium. But of course, I'm not a doctor, so I don't really know. But one would have to assume that it had something to do with it. And then slowly, the French government recognizes their work, grants them some money for full professorship for Pierre and a laboratory. And, it was slow in coming, but it does come. And in November 1904, Pierre gets an official paid position with 4,100 francs a year, which was, quite a bit of money for them anyway. But that's a teaching salary. They had no problems with making money teaching. What they had problems with is making money on their discovery. So those were two different things. And then a terrible thing happens. Pierre dies in a terrible accident. On October 6, 1906, he was crossing a street, Rue Dauphine, and he probably wasn't paying enough attention. His view was blocked by a slow cab, and he tried to cross the street, and he ran into a pair of draft horses that were trotting along and pulling a heavy load. And he falls between the horses. The horses don't actually trample him, but his head gets crushed by the wheel of the cart. And he died instantly. His body was carried to the police station where his papers were examined, and the Sorbonne was notified immediately. The president of the French Republic was informed and dispatched a representative to inform Mary, but she was not at home, and her father-in-law, who was home with a servant, did not answer the door. So soon after that, the official representative left. Soon after that, the dean of the faculty and one of the professors knocked on the door again, and Mr. Curie Sr., so the father of the deceased, answered the door, and the men were supposed to just tell Mary first, but the old man guessed it, and so they told him. Anyway, it was tragic. It was just a terrible, terrible, tragic thing that she really never got over. She was devastated by the news and had a very hard time making any sense of it. She was in shock. She had no idea how to react. She refused all the processions, the delegation, the speeches. She asked that Pierre be buried as simply as possible in the grave where his mother rested in Sceaux. And that's what happened. And it's really sad, but Marie wrote at that time, "In the street I walk as if hypnotized, without attending to anything. I shall not kill myself. I have not even the desire for suicide. But among all these vehicles, is there not one to make me share the fate of my beloved?" She was just completely broken. Her daughters were little, and neighbors stepped in to take care of the kids. But she was a wreck for the longest time, and I don't think she ever really fully accepted the fate of her husband and this terrible tragedy. So there she is, a widow, and he's the one making all the money, remember? And so she has to decide what she's going to do. Traditions. So now I'm quoting from one of the officials approaches her and says, "We would like to give you a pension that you can draw against your husband's retirement." And she says, "I am young enough to earn my living and that of my children." And so she refused the pension. And they had to sweep away traditions and customs to name Madame Curie a professor at the Sorbonne. Some of the professors insisted heavily, and eventually the Faculty of Science unanimously decided to maintain the chair created for Pierre Curie and to confide it to Marie Curie, and she would take the title of chargée de cours. It was the first time that a position in French higher education had been given to a woman, and when Marie heard about this, she, with some indifference at the time, her father-in-law was giving her the details, and she just said, "I will try." That's all she could do. And she writes in her diary, "I am offered the post of successor to you, my Pierre. Your course and the direction of your laboratory I have accepted. I don't know whether it is good or bad. You often told me you would have liked me to give a course at the Sorbonne, and I would like at least to take an effort to continue your work." And in another diary entry, she writes, "I want to tell you too that I have been named to your chair and that there have been some imbeciles to congratulate me on it." So she was really just completely distraught. So when she started teaching on the first day of class, the amphitheater was packed, and everybody was wondering what would be the first words the first woman at the Sorbonne would ever utter. Would she thank the university, the minister? Maybe she would speak of Pierre Curie. The custom was to begin by pronouncing a eulogy of the predecessor. But in this case, the predecessor was her husband and her working companion. So this is what she did. Marie stared, and this is described by her daughter, by the way. Marie stared straight ahead of her and said, "When one considers the progress that has been made in physics in the past 10 years, one is surprised at the advance that has taken place in our ideas concerning electricity and matter." Madame Curie had resumed the course at the precise sentence where Pierre Curie had left it, and that was that. And then she takes a really strange decision. She decides that she's never going to speak of their father to the orphans, to her daughters. She felt like she would be unable to speak about him without losing it, and that's just how she was. She didn't want to drag them into an atmosphere of tragedy. She just didn't want to talk about it. It happened, and she didn't want to relive it, and she didn't want to live through all these emotions. And that was another strange decision that she made. And then, now that her husband was dead, she had to decide what to do with the gram of radium that she and Pierre had prepared with their own hands, which was her private property. And against the advice of her father-in-law and several family members and many people, she decided that she was to gift this precious particle to her laboratory, which was worth more than 1 million gold francs at the time. In her mind, if it was inconvenient to be poor, it was superfluous and shocking to be very rich. The necessity for her daughters to earn their living later on seemed healthy and natural to her. So again, she does not want to profit from her discovery, only from her work. And she makes a very strong difference between the two, which I don't really get, but she did it. And then I'm going to skip a lot. I'm going to skip all the way to 1914 and the beginning of Second World War, because there Marie Curie was just outstanding. And this is not something that's very well known. She's a professor at the Sorbonne, but what happens is at the beginning of the war, a lot of students get called to war, a lot of professors too. And so her lab is empty and she can't really see any way to continue her work. And so she decides she wants to do something useful with her time. Marie Curie is 47 years old when the war is declared, and she decides that she is going to do something for her adoptive country. She closes down her laboratory, and like many other courageous French women, she becomes a nurse. And she wants to help organize health and medical services for the soldiers and the wounded. And specifically, she wants to help provide X-ray equipment to military hospitals. The X-ray had been discovered in 1895, and X-rays make it possible to explore, you've seen X-rays, right? You can see inside of the human body. You can see where the wounds are. You can see where the bone is broken. You can see a lot of things without opening the body. And so it's very, very vital to medical science. Marie had never dealt with X-rays, really. She had talked about them in lectures. She had taught students about the theory of X-ray, but she had never had one or done one. But she knew her subject very well, and she just decided that everybody needed X-ray machines. And like everything else she did, she went full speed ahead with this. But before she did that, she did something very interesting. She wanted to protect her gram of radium, which she had donated to the school, but still, she wanted to protect it. And so she took the train to Bordeaux from Paris. She had a heavy protective case with her, 20 kilograms, and she went to Bordeaux. She deposited the radium in a bank safe, and then she went back to Paris on the train. And then she was ready to work on the mobile X-ray cars. She was ill again. She had been ill on and off, like I mentioned, but she didn't care. She wanted the mobile X-ray cars. And the cars were named little Curies in the army zones. They were equipped by Marie and at the laboratory. So she did this work at her radium laboratory, and then she sent them off into the field. She raised money left and right. She knocked on every door, every rich person she knew. She asked for money. She asked for cars. She even said, "I shall give you back your motor car after the war. But of course, if it's not useless by then, I'll give it back to you." And so 20 cars were donated to be put in the service, but she did keep one little Renault car to get around for herself, because she had to go teach classes and train people. So how did they run this X-ray machine? Well, the X-ray machine was hooked up to the car, and at the right moment, so they put the patient in the machine, and at the right moment, the chauffeur, given a signal, started dynamo, and then she could do her X-ray. I'm not sure how it worked really, but she made it work somehow. So she'd lock herself into the dark room, develop the plates. She did all of that work and helped train many other people to do that work as well. But she wasn't just making stuff up as she went along. She thought through it. She perfected the technique as she went along, and she trained many people to do the same. And it's kind of cute. She never wore a nurse's uniform. She kept on dressing with a white laboratory blouse. That's how she dressed every day, and that's what she continued to do. And her daughter, Irene, who was 17, had started to help with this whole process, and she was a manipulator at first, so she was given missions to help out during the war as well. Now let me skip again to 2 years after the war. A magazine editor, Mrs. William Brown Maloney from New York, comes to interview Marie Curie in May 1920, and they hit it off really well. And this woman really made a big difference in her life, because when Marie told her that she would like to resume her study on radium, but that she doesn't own any of it, and that it's too expensive for her to buy, within a year that reporter had collected enough funds from women all over America. She launched a national campaign called the Marie Curie Radium Fund, and she really gathered up a lot of money so they could buy some radium for her. And in return, they wanted a visit to America from Marie, and Marie was hesitating because she doesn't like to be in the limelight. But then the reporter told her, "Well, your daughters will be, invited as well. Let's make it a big thing, and you'll get to meet the president, and it'll be wonderful." And Americans really didn't understand why Madame Curie should not be part of the Academy of Sciences in Paris. Yeah, it's surprising to me too. She had refused the Legion of Honor for the second time, and she just wasn't getting the recognition that not in the way she wanted it in France. But there she is. She decides to embark on a ship across the ocean to go visit America, which she had never seen. She found the ship very fancy. She found the food was overly complicated. She was probably a hoot, but not on a cruise. When she arrived in New York City, there was a throng of journalists waiting for her and ready to talk about her accomplishments in superlative terms. There were Girl Scouts and French officials and Polish officials and all sorts of people. I mean, honestly, Madame Curie was very determined to stay in the shadows. And in France, it worked. But in America, forget it. It didn't work. Her daughters, Irene and Eve, discovered that this lady was super famous and that everybody loved her and everybody wanted a piece of her. And she went all over the country. And there were lots of newspaper articles and all sorts of press about her. And one of the things that Americans loved most about her is that they found it very moving that this scorn for gain and this devotion to her intellectual passion, her desire to serve, she put that over everything. And I understand. That's one of the things that made her great. Marie was invited to visit universities, and she was asked by Mrs. Maloney, the reporter that started all to begin with. She was asked, "Naturally, you've brought your cap and gown, and that you will need them for these ceremonies." And Marie's like, "I didn't bring a university gown because I don't own one. I have never needed one because the masters of the Sorbonne are obliged to have a gown, but the Madame Curie, the only professor being a female, she just never got one. And so they had one made for her. In America, she was given titles, prizes, medals, doctoral degrees, bouquets. She heard speeches and gave brief thanks herself. She heard hymns and choruses. She got distinctions of all sorts. She went to banquets and she shook hands, and she was so overwhelmed that she was unable to protest. She never did any of that in France. She wouldn't have put up with it for 1 second. Marie Curie was very impressed with American university life. She said she was impressed by the brilliance and gaiety of the traditional ceremonies, the excellent conditions under which the students of the various colleges practice sports and physical development. She was impressed by the colossal power of the associations of women, which had brought her this far. She was just, the equipment of the scientific laboratories, the hospitals where Curie therapy was being used. It was all stunning to her, and a little bitter too, because she didn't manage all of that. France didn't manage all of that. Because by then, in 1921, France did not yet have a single hospital that was dedicated to Curie therapy or radium cancer treatment. And at one point she was asked, why did you renounce all that money? Because if you had kept the money, you would have been able to do Curie Therapy Hospital yourself. And this is what she had to say about that. A large number of my friends affirm, not without valid reasons, that if Pierre Curie and I had guaranteed our rights, we should have acquired the financial means necessary to the creation of a satisfactory radium institute without encountering the obstacles which were a handicap to both of us and which are still a handicap for me. Nevertheless, I am still convinced that we were right. Humanity certainly needs practical men who get the most out of their work without forgetting the general good, safeguard their own interests. But humanity also needs dreamers, for whom the disinterested development of an enterprise is so captivating that it becomes impossible for them to devote their care to their own material profit. Without the slightest doubt, these dreamers do not deserve wealth because they do not desire it. Even so, a well-organized society should assure to such workers the efficient means of accomplishing their task in a life freed from material care and freely consecrated to research. So she knew all along what she was giving up on. But it was a choice. It was a reasoned choice. And as a matter of fact, when the gram of radium was offered to her by the Americans, when she read over the paper, she realized that they were giving it to her personally. And she put up a fight about that, and she said, as so long as I'm alive, it goes without saying that I shall use it only for scientific work. But if we leave things in this state, the radium would become the property of private persons after my death, of my daughters. This is impossible. I want to make it a gift to my laboratory. Can we call in a lawyer right now? And that's exactly what they did. They called in a lawyer and they reworked the paperwork so that it was clear that this gram of radium was a donation to her laboratory, not to her personally. So she never deviated from that belief. She just stuck with it. And finally, at long last, in 1922, the Academy of Medicine in Paris submitted a petition for Madame Curie to be accepted into the Academy of Science. And she agreed. And this is what was said to welcome her into the science. They said, "We salute in you a great scientist, a great-hearted woman who has lived only through devotion to work and scientific abnegation, a patriot who, in war as in peace, has always done more than her duty. Your presence here brings us moral benefit of your example and the glory of your name. We thank you." she wasn't bitter. She took it. She accepted it. And with the fame at the end of her life came thousands of letters and requests, and people wrote to her in simplified addresses that they didn't look up her address. Well, how could they? They didn't have Google, right? But they would just take an envelope and write Madame Curie, Paris. I'm writing to Madame Curie in Paris, or Madame Curie, scientist, France. And a lot of people wrote to her just to ask for autographs, or she got letters from crazy people. And so she put together a printed card that answered the autograph hunters. And if you go to joinusinfrance.com/79, you will see a copy. I took a photo of that in the museum. I thought that was really great. It says, Madame Curie does not wish to give autographs or sign photographs and asks you to excuse her. She would stick that in an envelope and send it back to the person. And she also ignored all the crazy people because she got letters from people who wrote like 8-10 pages. They were misunderstood inventors, persecuted madmen in love, threatening madmen. She got so many of those that she just ignored those. But people who just wanted her autograph and her, a signed picture, she just told them to get lost. Marie Curie died age 67 on July 4th, 1934. What killed her was a pernicious anemia. She had been sick on and off for many years, but at the end, the last few weeks, she had these terrible fevers that nothing could fix. And she just withered away and died. But until those last few days, she was an amazing, hyperactive researcher and woman. Her husband was no doubt a wonderful intellectual who helped her greatly and who definitely deserves praise for giving her all the credit that he could. But what a woman she was. And if you get a chance to find yourself in Paris, do go visit her too small museum. It's a beautiful little museum. I'm putting lots of pictures of it on joinusinfrance.com/79. I enjoyed the visit immensely. It's free. You can give a donation. They do have a donation box at the end. They have a very small little bookstore. So if you want to hear about Marie Curie to this day, you have to go looking for the information because she's not a superstar of science. She's no Neil deGrasse Tyson, even though she accomplished a tremendous amount. And this fabulous little museum was renovated, as I mentioned, and reopened in 2012. And again, the French government fell short. It was renovated thanks to a donation from Eve Curie, her daughter, and the author of the book that I based a lot of this information on. The museum is open Wednesdays through Saturday from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. Admission is free, and you will see some fabulous instruments, some pictures, some letters, all sorts of things. And having listened to this show, I think you will enjoy it immensely, because once you know all this stuff, you're like, oh, this is what this is, and it'll be very fun for you. All right, well, this is a very long episode. I knew it would be because I loved this stuff so much. Thank you very much for listening. Anything you can do to spread the word about the show, I would be most grateful for. And thank you for those of you also who go to joinusinfrance.com/support to find out about the ways that you can help support the show. Thank you very much. I'll talk to you next week. Au revoir. This brings us to the end of another Join Us in France travel podcast. You can leave a comment on the website, follow us on Facebook, or look for @Pierres Podcast on Twitter. I put lots of information on Facebook and Twitter that never makes it into the shows. And also, this is a subliminal message. Join the mailing list. Now, today. You can do that on joinusinfriends.com. Look for the green button. Et c'est tout pour aujourd'hui.